The first light of dawn hadn't yet broken through the dense pines when Aiden Brody stirred in his cabin. The forest around him was still, draped in a hush that only winter could bring, thick, reverent, like nature holding its breath. He had grown used to this silence, to the solitude that wrapped his life like the worn-wool blanket he pulled tighter around his shoulders. But that morning, something was off. It wasn't a sound that woke him. It was a presence. A deep, inexplicable tug in his gut. He rose, barefoot, the floorboards cold beneath him, and moved toward the door with the slow, wary instinct of a man who had once reported from war zones but now lived in self-exile. When he opened it, the world outside was wrapped in fog and snow, a silent cathedral of trees. And there she was. A bear. Not lumbering. Not prowling. She was sitting. Still. Watching. Aiden froze, not in fear, but in disbelief. The bear was massive, a fully grown mother grizzly, her fur matted with frost, her breath rising in soft plumes. But what rooted Aiden to the spot wasn't her size or proximity, it was her posture. She wasn't menacing. She was waiting. And then he saw it. At her feet, curled in a pitiful heap on the wooden porch, was a cub. Barely breathing, its fur soaked and clumped with blood and melted snow. The bear mother made no sound. She didn't move toward him, didn't challenge. She simply looked, her eyes not wild or frantic, but holding something almost impossible to name. Trust. Desperation. A plea. Aiden's breath caught. He had seen that look once before, in the gaze of a woman in Kandahar clutching her injured child, begging for help with no common words to use, only humanity left between them. Time slipped. Logic stumbled. Fear, that ancient voice, whispered to slam the door and stay inside. But something deeper, older, louder rose up inside him. A pulse. A knowing. He stepped outside. The snow crunched beneath his feet as he approached the cub cautiously, his heart thundering against his ribs. The mother bear didn't move, didn't growl, just watched. Kneeling, he saw the cub's shallow breaths, the faint tremble in its flank. A gash along its side was crusted with frozen blood. One leg was twisted unnaturally. It was dying. His hands hovered for a second. Then he scooped it up, carefully, cradling it like he had once cradled his baby niece years ago, when his sister still spoke to him. He turned and walked back into the cabin. Behind him, the bear let out a single, low sound. Not a warning. Not a threat. Something like a sigh. Inside, the cabin transformed. No longer just a sanctuary for a lonely man. It became a triage ward, a shelter, a place where something sacred was happening. He stoked the fire, wrapped the cub in towels, whispered to it like it could understand. The old satellite phone rang and crackled as he called the nearest veterinary emergency line, miles away. He followed their instructions with trembling fingers. Outside, through the frost-laced window, the mother bear remained, seated, still, as if she knew he had taken the burden willingly. As the light finally broke over the treetops and spilled gold across the snow, Aiden realized something with bone-deep clarity. This was not just an encounter with an animal. This was an invocation. A fragile moment between worlds, where the wild had reached out to man, not in rage or fear, but in hope. And he had answered. The cabin was quiet except for the sharp, irregular breathing of the injured cub and the low crackle of the fire. Aiden moved with the care of someone handling something holy, his hands trembling as he pressed a warm compress to the cub's side. Blood, dark, half-frozen, stained the towel, and he grimaced, his jaw tight. He hadn't touched another living creature this intimately in years. Not since the war. Not since the world he knew had come undone. But this wasn't war. Or maybe it was. A war against indifference. Outside, the bear mother still waited, an unmoving sentinel beneath the falling snow. She made no sound, showed no fear, no aggression. It was as if she had placed her faith, however wild, however ancient, in the hands of a man she did not know. And somehow, impossibly, she was right. Aiden had once been a journalist who told the stories of others. Now he was the story, staring down a truth he hadn't felt in years, that to save something vulnerable is not weakness. It's the purest instinct of being human. He wrapped the cub tighter in his jacket, held it close to his chest. Its small heart fluttered against his ribs like a moth trapped in a jar. He whispered to it, not words, just sound low and steady, the kind of sound that lives at the edge of lullabies and prayers. He could feel it fading, and for a moment, fear gripped him. Not the kind that makes you run, but the kind that crushes your breath. The vet on the other end of the crackling call had said there wasn't much that could be done without surgery. But something in Aiden rejected that. Not out of arrogance, but out of something older than logic. Conviction. He had seen enough death. Too much. In sand-choked alleys. In collapsed homes. In the haunted eyes of children who learned to stop crying because it changed nothing. But here, in this cabin, in this forest that had nearly swallowed him whole in loneliness, he had been given a choice. And he made it. He boiled water for sterilization. He stitched the torn flesh, hands unsteady but guided by memory. The memory of field medics under fire, of patching wounds with trembling fingers and cursing gods both real and imagined. The cub whimpered once, then went still, not limp, but trusting. And in that stillness, something broke open in Aiden. A part of him that had gone dormant after the last funeral, after the last goodbye, now stirred. Not loudly, not with fanfare, but like the first ember in an old hearth catching breath again. The hours passed. Snow deepened outside. He fed the cub sugar water with an eyedropper. He wrapped it in a sweater. He gave it a name. He didn't say it aloud, not yet, but he thought it Ash. Because that's what this life had become, ash and silence. But maybe, just maybe, there were embers left beneath the gray. Outside, the bear never left. At one point, through the fogged glass, he saw her shift her weight and let out a long, low exhale. It sounded almost like relief. That night, Aiden didn't sleep. He sat beside the cub as the wind howled outside, as the cabin creaked and the forest sighed. And when dawn returned, pale and golden, spilling across the floorboards like hope itself, he found himself staring not at a wounded animal, but at a small, beating piece of life that had pulled him, forcibly, out of the wreckage of his own. He reached over and touched the cub's paw gently. It twitched. And for the first time in years, Aiden Brody wept, not out of sorrow, but out of the overwhelming clarity of purpose. He was no longer just surviving. He was protecting something again. And that changed everything. The days blurred into one another like brushstrokes on a fogged window, soft and uncertain, fragile as breath on glass. Snow fell relentlessly, muting the world outside, but inside the cabin, something small, something stubborn, was beginning to fight for life. The cub, still wrapped in Aiden's old flannel shirt, stirred more often now. Its breathing had deepened, no longer the thin thread of survival but the first, hesitant notes of a return. Aiden hadn't left the cabin since that morning the bear had appeared. He barely slept. The only rhythm that mattered was the cub's breath, the slow healing of its wound, the flickers of response in its eyes. He fed it carefully, milk warmed over the stove, sweetened drops on a fingertip, slow encouragements murmured under his breath. "You're all right now," he'd say, voice cracking like firewood. "You're safe. Stay with me." But healing, he knew, was never just physical. The mother bear came and went, never far. She would appear in the tree line at dusk, sometimes closer, sometimes not. She didn't scratch or snarl or demand. She just waited, as if trusting Aiden more than Aiden trusted himself. That kind of trust, it did something to a man. It carved open the parts of him that had closed up like old wounds. And as the cub began to walk again, unsteady but determined, Aiden began to feel something he had long thought extinct: connection. He spoke to the cub constantly, not just to soothe it, but because it anchored him. He told it things no one else knew. That he had once held a child who didn't make it through the night. That he had once held a gun instead of a camera. That he had once wanted to disappear, and almost had. And now he was holding something that wanted to live. He named her Ash aloud one morning, kneeling on the cabin floor while the fire glowed behind him. Ash, he whispered, the name thick on his tongue. You came out of the fire. You came back. Ash looked up at him then, just for a moment, and in that gaze was the quiet defiance of every survivor he had ever met. But nothing this pure survives untested. The third week, the snow thawed just enough for footprints to be visible on the edge of his property. Human ones. Hunters, maybe. Or worse, locals. Word had spread, it seemed, that the reclusive journalist in the woods was keeping a wild animal in his home. Aiden had seen the tracks and felt the weight in his chest return, cold and sharp. He wasn't sure which bothered him more, that someone had been there or that someone might come back. He moved Ash into the basement during the nights, just in case. He darkened the windows, kept the fire low. His world, once again, contracted. She grew stronger, but he grew more vigilant. He didn't blame the people out there. Not really. Fear made people stupid, made them cruel. But he also knew something they didn't. This wasn't about taming the wild. It was about answering it. Something had reached across the divide between instinct and language, and he had reached back. It wasn't a pet. It wasn't a project. It was a promise. One morning, he opened the door and found a small bundle placed on the porch. A dead rabbit. Fresh. Deliberate. The mother bear's offering. He stared at it for a long time, that silent tribute from a creature the world had taught him to fear. And in that still moment, it hit him. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were trusting each other, trading fear for something ancient and wordless. Something almost like love. Ash healed slowly, the way wounded things always do, through time, quiet, and unbearable tenderness. And Aiden, too, found himself changing. His voice grew stronger, his eyes clearer. He wrote again, just a few lines in a journal he hadn't opened in years. Not for the world. For himself. Some lives aren't saved in hospitals. Some are saved by being needed. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and cast the forest in liquid gold, Ash took her first full steps outside. Wobbly, blinking at the light. Aiden followed, heart pounding, breath tight. She paused, sniffed the air, and then there she was. Her mother. Waiting. Watching. Ash looked back at him once before stepping forward into the trees. He didn't call her. Didn't beg her to stay. Because loving something wild means letting it go when it's ready. But as the two bears vanished into the forest mist, Aiden stayed on the porch, hands clenched at his sides, heart torn open. And still he smiled. Because the cabin no longer felt like a place of hiding. It felt like a place where something had lived. And that was enough. The snow receded like a memory, slow and reluctant. Winter was loosening its grip on the forest, but in Aiden's cabin, the silence remained, no longer cold or empty, but soft, like the quiet that lingers after a lullaby. The days began to stretch longer, sunlight filtering through the trees in golden threads, weaving across the worn floorboards where Ash now wandered freely, stronger with each passing sunrise. There were no grand events. No epiphanies announced by thunder or revelation. Just the simple rhythm of healing, of presence. Aiden would rise before dawn and light the fire, moving carefully so as not to disturb Ash curled at the foot of the hearth. She had grown larger, her coat darker, her eyes more alert. But she still watched him with the same trust that had first stopped him in his tracks, the kind of gaze that said, I am here because of you. And he, though he never said it, was still there because of her. They shared everything, his morning rituals, his silence, the soft jazz records he dug up from an old box. She'd tilt her head at the sound of the saxophone, sometimes lifting her nose as if catching some scent woven into the music. He wrote again, quietly, just enough to feel like himself again. He didn't write for publication, not anymore. Just fragments in a leather notebook. Sentences like veins, carrying emotion instead of blood. We don't choose the things that save us. They just arrive. Ash would often rest her head on his knee while he read aloud. Not that she understood the words, but there was something in the cadence, in his voice growing steady again, that felt like a bridge between their two worlds. He would read poetry sometimes, Rilke, Plath, a few battered lines of Mary Oliver. He always paused on the lines about wilderness, about stillness, about love that doesn't seek to possess. Outside, the forest was waking up. Buds bloomed. Birds returned. The air smelled of thawed earth and beginnings. Aiden began to leave the door open during the day, letting Ash explore the clearing, though she never wandered far. He could watch her from the porch, sniffing at the moss, chasing shadows. He watched her the way a father might, equal parts awe and terror, knowing full well that she didn't belong to him. Not really. But for now, she stayed. And that was enough. The townsfolk had started whispering. He'd hear the talk when he went into town for supplies. He's keeping a bear in his house, someone would mutter behind the checkout. Crazy old war reporter. Must have snapped. He didn't correct them. He didn't explain. There was no point. You can't explain to people who have never been broken how a broken thing can still be beautiful. He stopped going into town altogether after a while. Stocked up on dry goods, cut his own firewood, avoided the noise. His world didn't need defending anymore. It just needed tending. Ash began to rest her head on his chest in the evenings, the way she did that first night. The weight of her, warm and solid, had become his anchor. Sometimes he dreamed she was gone, that she had wandered too far, that the forest had taken her back. He would wake from those dreams gasping, drenched in sweat. But she'd still be there, curled up in the orange flicker of the firelight, chest rising and falling like the slow tide of something eternal. The days passed like this. Quietly. Honestly. A man and a bear, each haunted in their own way, each choosing, again and again, to stay. And though no one else saw it, Aiden knew he had built something holy in that silence. Not a sanctuary, not even a friendship in the human sense. Just a space where neither of them had to carry the weight of their past alone. It was a morning unlike any other. No thunder. No signs. Just a silence that felt fuller than usual, like the world was holding its breath. Ash had grown. She no longer fit beneath the table, where she once curled. Her gait was strong now, her shoulder muscles coiled with instinct, and her eyes, oh, her eyes, held that untamable glint of something ancient waking up. Aiden knew. He had known for days, maybe weeks. There were moments when Ash would stare beyond the trees as if hearing a call only she could recognize. Her ears would twitch, and her body would lean forward just slightly, like a compass drawn toward true north. At first, he called her back with a soft whistle. Then he stopped. Let her decide. Let the stillness speak for itself. That morning, he didn't light the fire. He didn't prepare the milk. He stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, watching as she paced near the edge of the clearing. The forest beyond was coming alive with spring. The mother bear had returned, silent and solemn, waiting again among the shadows. No longer desperate, no longer wounded, just waiting. Ash turned to him. He dropped to one knee, not to hold her back, not to beg, just to look at her one last time for my level. His voice broke with something deeper than sorrow, something that felt like gratitude carved into bone. You did good, little girl. She stepped toward him, nuzzled her snout into his shoulder. He let his hand rest behind her ears, felt the warmth of her fur, the rise of her breath. And then, slowly, she pulled away. No resistance, no confusion, just that quiet grace of something that had been healed and now understood it was time. He watched her cross the clearing, watched as she paused for only a second before vanishing into the green with her mother. No glance back. No farewell. She belonged to the wild again. And he, weirdly, felt no emptiness. Inside the cabin, everything remained exactly as it had been. The flannel shirt folded on the floor, the claw marks on the doorframe, the soft scratches on the floorboards from her playful stumbles. Relics of a time not meant to last, but never meant to be forgotten. He sat on the porch until dusk. The forest was full again, but in a different way. He could hear life everywhere, leaves rustling, distant calls, the hush of wind. The world had accepted her return without hesitation. No applause. No drama. Just welcome. That night, he wrote only one line in his journal. She came wounded and left whole. And I, a left seen. A week later, he went into town. He nodded to the same cashier who once looked at him like a madman. He smiled at the old couple who crossed the street when he passed. He felt no need to explain. Some stories were too sacred to be wasted on small talk. He came home, brewed a cup of tea, and stood at the window where the light touched the trees. He thought of Ash, of grace that never demanded thanks. And he whispered to the forest, to no one and to everything, "Thank you for lending her to me." And in the hush that followed, he could almost hear the forest reply, "Thank you for giving her back."